Hello there, Michelle Short here for My Favourite Things. Today I have a card to share with you, ink blending on die cuts using the Perfect Poppies set. So let's get started. This is the Perfect Poppies Dynamics, really lovely set. There are die cuts to create 3 different poppies in the set along with stems and leaves, and I have cut the petals for the poppies from snow cone cardstock. And then I've cut the leaves from limelight cardstock and also the inside of the poppies with black licorice. So I have gone to the MFT website and I've printed off this kind of instruction sheet here so that I can see which layers go with which poppy and I can see how I need to layer them up. So I'm going to use this as reference throughout my video. So I can see here this first poppy, I want to do ink blending on these layers, so I can see which I want to be my darkest and which I want to be my lightest. Obviously you can change things around, but that instruction guide does give you a really good kind of visual look at how they kind of line up together. So I'm going to add ink blending, like I said, with Distress inks, and I'm going to go in with my lightest shade first, which is Mermaid Lagoon, and I'm just going to add it to the very edge of this piece here. The benefit of using coloured cardstock as opposed to white cardstock is that I can use that colour as my lightest shade. So the Mermaid Lagoon that I'm adding on top, which is going to be the lighter shade on some of the darker layers, actually turns out to be like the darkest shade, which is really good. So it's quite helpful die cutting sometimes with coloured cardstock rather than white cardstock. So for this layer here, I want this to be quite a little bit darker, but I don't want it to be as dark as the last layer. So I go in first with the Mermaid Lagoon, and then I'm going in with Prize Ribbon, and I'm adding a small of that to that centre petal, and then I do go in with Chip Sapphire because I wanted it to be a little bit darker, but I decided that actually I didn't really like it. It made it a little bit dull and I wanted these to be fairly bright. So I'm going back in with the Prize Ribbon and I'm just adding a darker concentration over the top. And although this one didn't turn out as nice as the other poppies, I did learn from it, so it's always quite helpful. So for the second poppy here, I'm just doing the same thing, going in with Mermaid Lagoon to start with for the lighter petals, and then I do go back in with that Prize Ribbon. I'm just adding a small amount to the lighter layers and then more concentration to the darker layers. And then I can just finish up with the last poppy here as well. And I found it quite helpful to have the pieces in this way, so like do one poppy at a time, just so that I can really see where the darker areas are going to be. And then for the leaves and the stems, I decided to cut them all out. I knew at this point that I probably wouldn't use all of the leaves, and I didn't, but it's quite nice to have options. So I'm starting off with Twisted Citron, and I realised that actually that was pretty much the same colour as the Limelight cardstock. So then I'm going in instead with the Maude Lawn ink. And I'm just adding a small amount of that to different areas on the stems. And then I can go in with Rustic Wilderness just to add a little bit of extra darkness towards the bottom of the leaves. And at the end I do end up cutting a different leaf. So here I've got them all laid out so that the leaves go with the stems, how it is in that instruction sheet, but obviously you could do whatever you wanted to. You can mix and match them, no problem at all the different stems and leaves, you know, definitely. But I'm not actually going to assemble the whole thing here. I'm just going to assemble the poppies on their own, because I do know that how I'm going to add the stems is going to be in a slightly different way, and I didn't want to do it whilst they were kind of attached to the flowers, but you definitely could kind of adhere everything together at this point. So I've added my first layer on with some On Point Precision glue. Anytime that I move the die cut outside of the screen, it's because I'm dabbing off the excess glue from the back of the die cut so that I don't have too much kind of squishing out. So I placed that kind of lightest layer on so that I can see exactly where I wanted to place the inside of the flower kind of underneath it, so that I can kind of pop it. When you add this one on top, it kind of pops underneath, if that makes sense. So I'm just going to do the same thing for the other poppies here. Again, I like to just kind of add the layers on so that I can see exactly where I want them to end up and see where I want that stamen piece to go in as well. So just adding some on point precision glue to the backs of those, again dabbing off the excess, and then I can add that last petal on top, and then there is another one that goes on top of that as well. Realised here that that piece of the petal kind of overhangs, so I didn't want it to stick to my craft mat, so I'm just removing the excess glue there, and then I can finish off with the lightest layer. And that kind of makes it so that it looks like the petal is kind of folded over on itself. I really like how these all kind of layer up together. They're quite quick and easy, and like I said, quite easy to layer up, but with that instruction guide it's even easier. To be honest, I'm sure I probably could have figured it out, but it's quite nice just to be able to see exactly how they were meant to be. So I can just pop that last stamen piece behind there, and I realised I didn't quite add enough glue, so I'm just adding a little bit more on. My inked pieces are still a little bit wet at this point, so the glue isn't sticking as well as it would do without me kind of really pressing down. But as it kind of sits aside to dry, that will dry no problem and really nice and strong. So I can just pop that last piece down there. And then, like I said, I'm going to leave the stems and the leaves till a little bit later. Next, I want to stamp a sentiment, and I'm taking the sentiment that says happy birthday from the All Occasions Scripted Greetings set. And I know that I want to fit it on my panel here underneath the poppies, but I want the stems to kind of go through the sentiment. So I'm just working out here where I want the sentiment to be stamped, and then I can stamp it down onto my panel. And my panel is 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches, and I'm stamping that with some Versafine Clair Nocturne ink, which is a pigment ink, and it's really nice and sharp black. So I'm just pressing that down, and I didn't add my magnet on, so I'm glad that I managed to get a good impression first time. And then here I'm working out where I want to cut my stems. So I decided that I wanted the sentiment to kind of be nestled inside of the kind of stems. So I'm cutting the stem so that a piece of it is above the sentiment and then a piece of it is underneath the sentiment. If you wanted to recreate this card and you didn't want to do that, I think it would look really nice with a die cut sentiment, or even the sentiment being up on a banner. I'm kind of doing it the hard way, and in all honesty, although I really like how the card turned out in the end, this bit took the longest out of everything that I did on the card. But I do like that you've kind of got those circle pieces at the top of the stem, so if you do want to add them to the back of the poppies, they do stick on really nicely without kind of wiggling around too much. But obviously I'm adding them in a slightly different way anyway. So here I've got the other part of that stem, and I'm going to cut off the inside bit, so like the center of the stem, so that I can just have the bottom piece, and then I can adhere that underneath where that B is. But I am going to bring back the other piece of the stem so that it gives me a guide of how far I want to actually stick the other part of the stem. I ended up not doing that for the other stems, and I just kind of eyeballed it, because even if I added it lower it wouldn't really matter because I'm just elongating the stem. But it just gave me a guide for the first one. And then I'm just finishing up here with the last piece of that stem. So I added the others on. Like I said, this did take me a little while, so I did cut that out of the video, purely just because it did take some time to kind of figure out where I actually wanted them all to be placed. But I do like the look of it. Before I stick the poppies on top, I'm going to add some thin foam tape onto the back of this panel, and then I can adhere it down onto an A2 size white card base. So that's a finished size of 4 1/4 inches by 5 1/2 inches. and I can just kind of hover it over the card base, and then once I think it's where I want it to be in the center, I can press that down. I've then added some more thin foam tape onto the back of the poppies themselves, and then I can place them down onto the card. So obviously I've gone for a non-traditional colour scheme for these poppies, using them in blues rather than red, and I do really love red poppies, and I especially love that they symbolise remembrance. But I thought I would do something a little bit different and have them blue so that I could use them as a birthday card, because I really love poppies, and I think that I wonder that if I put them red poppies on a happy birthday card, it may not quite have the same effect, if that makes sense. So I really love them in blue actually. I think they would look really pretty in lots of different colours, and although they are obviously meant to be poppies, in some ways I think the colour kind of changes them into just general lovely flowers. So I do really like how they turned out. I am adding some sequins here, some iridescent sequins without holes in the middle. And then I realised at this point I completely forgot to add the leaves in. So I knew that I wasn't going to add the leaves on the stems how I did it because of the sentiment being in, but I did originally plan that I was going to have some leaves kind of poked all around. Now the great thing is, because I added the poppies with foam tape and I didn't add a huge amount onto the back, I've got some room to pop these leaves behind, so that was really quite helpful. The only thing is, for the leaf that I'm going to add on the right hand side, I would have added it where those sequins are. Now I could have just lifted off the sequins and it wouldn't really matter if I had a bit of glue or anything underneath it, because the leaf would cover it, but I decided just to try and add the leaf just above it. So I cut a little bit of that leaf down because there was a bit of foam tape on that side, so just cutting it down made it so that I could pop it underneath a little bit easier. So the leaves weren't quite in the exact same place that I probably would have done it if I hadn't have added the sequins on first, but I still like how it turned out. Links to the products that I used will be listed in the description bar here on YouTube. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.